in Washington, in London, in Paris, in Berlin, in every capital. Leaders are looking at balance sheets and figuring out political, humanitarian, and economic costs and benefits, and figuring out, well, what do we do? There are all these ways of calculating the cost and calculating the benefits of doing anything. So what should have been taken into consideration, Phyllis, and what, in your view, was not?
Well, I'm afraid that what was not taken into consideration, among other things, there were a number of questions. Humanitarian law was not taken into consideration. But also, I think the question of the direct cost to people in the United States was not taken into account. Somehow, with all of the talk of deficits and deficit spending and how bad the cuts are going to be, and we have to tighten our belts and bite the bullet, and whatever analogy you want to use, we're talking cutbacks for the poor and tax breaks for the rich. What we're not hearing is what's the immediate cost of a new third U.S. war in the Middle East, and where do we think the money's going to come from? I heard from my colleague, we had the 110 Tomahawk missiles at the cost of $1.1 million apiece just the first day, just the missiles. That's not counting the cost of the ships and the planes and the pilots and everything else, but just the missiles themselves. That $110 million could have paid instead for 2,200 new green jobs in the U.S. for a year. Middle class, $50,000 a year jobs. Now, how do we do the balance sheet? What's going to make us safer? Using the money on Tomahawk missiles or using the money on green jobs? Now, I'm an internationalist. I don't think that the only consideration is what's good for us, because I don't think if the world is at risk in terms of security, in terms of famine, in terms of drought, in terms of all those things, that we're going to be safe either. So I think we do have to look abroad. But I don't think that using money for the military without taking into account the real cost, and there is a link. You know, we think, Ray, sometimes that the war stuff is kind of separate from the other calculations. But here's another trade-off issue. If we look at Wisconsin, which has been so much the centerpiece of the fight back against these deficits and these problems in the economy for ordinary people in this country, we see that the state deficit in Wisconsin is $1.8 billion. Now that's a lot of money. That's not chump change. That's a lot of money. The amount of money that Wisconsin taxpayers, only Wisconsin taxpayers, will pay this year, 2011, just for this year's share of the war in Afghanistan, which 78% of Americans say we don't want to be fighting, they will pay $1.7 billion. So you could argue that if we were not at war in Afghanistan, we would not have this kind of a state deficit in Wisconsin. It's a very direct calculation.
Well, at the risk of being a pain in the neck, but I guess that comes with the job, American workers make Tomahawk missiles.
They do.
And American mathematicians and physicists design the guidance systems, and American metals fabricators make the skin
Absolutely.
for it,
Yes,
and
but
the American explosives makers. So those 110 Tomahawk missiles, now
Right.
that they're blown up, we're going to go back to the people who made them. They're
And
going to
make
work
more.
2 or 3 shifts a day. We're going to make some more. Granted, this is not the best spin-off, best multiplier effect expenditure of American money, but it's not as if the money just disappears into the ether
right.
either.
But there's one very direct counter to that. It's not just that it's not the best. It's actually the worst. If you look at the tables of, if you invest $1 billion in military production, in healthcare costs, in education, or in new green technologies, those 4, the military is at the bottom by a huge margin, weighed against any of those others. If you invest to create new jobs, you will create far more jobs. I don't remember the exact ratio. My institute did a study on this a few months ago. But if you compare the job creation for military spending as opposed to any of those other categories, you come out way behind. So that's not a good article for using more Tomahawk missiles.
Well, and another irony I would point out is the amount of petroleum products we use in war. So that part of what got us into this entire situation is our dependence on oil. Well, part of that dependence is to fuel every military machine that operates in Afghanistan, in Iraq, still to a lesser degree, and now in Libya. I mean, it's gargantuan amounts of oil.
Jane, is that point of view heard as much as other points of view in the national debate. If you walk into the public square and say, wait a minute, I want to talk about using that money in another way, or using it in a way that benefits the poor, can you make that argument with the same volume, with the same attention as the let's get in there and get Gaddafi argument?
If we had as much access to the media as the military-industrial complex did, perhaps it would resonate, but it does resonate on the streets. People are calling for the dismantling of the military-industrial complex precisely because it's such a self-perpetuating and losing proposition. If we were to use those materials, the petroleum products, and we were to invest in labor, in education, in housing, in healthcare, we would be addressing our national security interests, and we wouldn't be in this void, that this constant suck. But I also wanted to remind everybody that when they talked about the lack of voice on a national level with Congress, to remind everyone that in DC, we don't even have a voice in Congress. We don't even have statehood. And all of these issues sort of get subsumed by these perceived international crises that we have to go into that are sucking us dry. So I also want to put that on the table, our lack of representation. And so maybe the frustration of the people nationally and in Congress can appreciate our perspective.